Alright, okay, you knew it was coming. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Real Life Podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the Cornetto Trilogy. Now, last week I mentioned Last Night in Soho, claiming it was Edgar Wright's most aesthetically pleasing film, but it ain't my favourite, and I was considering doing an episode about Hollywood comedies, the big blockbuster-style comedies that hit cinemas and do traditionally very well at the box office, and that episode may still happen, but it got me thinking about really good comedies that I love, because those tend to fall not into that bracket. So, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and World's End are 3 films held to worship status by so many people, and have now created a place for themselves amongst the greatest comedies ever made. 3 films with, give or take one of the Andes, immensely similar casts, which all tell very different, very mad, and very funny stories, all put together brilliantly by director Edgar Wright. They're so named because somebody, somewhere during the film, enjoys a cornetto or two. The reason why these films, I think, have gained such a cult following is because they aren't just comedies, they're actually containing of incredible levels of cinematic merit. They stem from Wright's partnership with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, and as such have gained immense popularity. But people are often confused as to why they have such a great time with these films, despite the fact that they get on with them so agreeably. So today, in this episode, I'm going to go through them one by one and attempt to try and analyse why I think it is people have such a great time with these 3 films. Beginning with Shaun of the Dead. So Shaun of the Dead is the first of the 3 releases, and it could have been made into any other zombie film spoof, with cliche after cliche being poured onto a script and heightened to the nth degree for comedic effect. However, this stands out in the slightly niche category that is zombie comedy, due to its construction. Wright uses typical filmmaking shots in the film, like Peter Serafinowicz appearing in silhouette at the closing of the bathroom cupboard. However, he also combines these more traditional shots with newer, more impressive sequences. The first notable sequence consists of Shaun, the first of Simon Pegg's lead roles in this trilogy, on his trip to the shop on a usual day versus his experience post-mass infection. This is Wright's subtle yet seemingly blindingly obvious way of making an audience engage with the setting of a film by creating all the focal points in a sequence in the background of the picture. So an audience focuses not simply on the subjective view of the character, but instead they're gazing beyond that and looking into the wider frame, which is a great way of capturing the audience's attention. Often films can be criticised for being quite sort of geeky and indulgent for the director if everything is in the background and hidden away and everything is subtext. People often call it nerdy, where you have to do a video with 30 things that you missed or this ending explained. And actually, Wright uses it to his advantage by making things not necessarily in the foreground, but not far enough in the background that they're completely unnoticeable. And actually what it does is advance the plot really cleverly and does it subconsciously to an audience, so that instead of being forced into a car and having the door slammed on you and being driven somewhere, you're being chauffeured around the place. There's so many great sequences in this film, like the one we mentioned at the start, but also the incredibly famous Don't Stop Me Now fight scene in the pub, which if you haven't seen, even if you haven't seen the rest of the film, the clips on YouTube, definitely go and watch it. It's a brilliantly crafted piece of work. It's funny, it's really well choreographed, and there's still a level of tension about the whole thing, despite the fact that that moment is obviously ridiculous. There's still a great level of tension because there are thousands of zombies outside trying to break down the walls. It's something these films do very well. They are comedies, but they also have the undertone of a horror film in which there is tension and panic amongst the audience. The Pegg-Frost partnership kicks off really well in this film. Obviously, that's a theme throughout all of them, but in this film, it really feels like it gets off to a great start. They are essentially the same character, except they seem to play 2 opposites of each other. Shaun likes to think himself as a get-up-and-go kind of guy, whereas Nick Frost's character is quite happy being a kind of delinquent and carefree. However, they still end up in the same situations and reach the same conclusions as each other. It's quite a gruesome film. The scene where Dylan Moran's insides are ripped out of him is graphic, but it's hilariously fitting. The whole film is constructed in a way which makes you feel as if you aren't just watching a bog-standard comedy film. There's thought gone into it, and it's classic Wright. There's loads of fast cuts, there's loads of swish transitions, almost like it's a Soderbergh comedy. It's one of the things Wright does really well in terms of moving his story on without ever feeling boring. The transition phases feel like they're exciting. All the character interactions are done really well. I love the casting of Penelope Wilton as Shaun's mother. She's a brilliantly optimistic force to the piece, despite the fact that one could very easily be greatly pessimistic. I like the fact that she's completely the opposite, that even when she is facing death, is beautifully caring and loving, and it's a character that I really love to watch, and Penelope Wilton is an absolutely fantastic presence in everything she's in. I really, really think you get your money's worth with her. As with any great comedy, the little moments, the little quirks that characters have are used brilliantly, and my favourite of those is when the gang are being instructed on how to walk like a zombie as if it's an amateur dramatics class. It's really brilliantly crafted, it's hilariously parodied, it's fantastically done. It's still a zombie film, of course. There are still the horror elements that have to go into it, and Wright does it very well. There's tension, there's fear. The scene where Phil does turn into a zombie is brilliant, and again, it's quotable. It's a very quotable film, as are the other three. I often say to my friends who look gormlessly at me because they think, what are you talking about, that they've got red on them? Or why don't we just have a cold one and wait for this all to blow over? There's so many great elements to this film, and it kicked off the trilogy really well, so I'm very glad that they decided to make some more. Shaun of the Dead is available most places. I think it's on Netflix, so you really don't have an excuse not to watch this. It's a brilliant film. If you haven't seen it, you must. Great start. Now, we come on to what is quite possibly my favourite film of all time. Everyone said when I was starting this podcast that the first episode should be my favourite films. But that's dangerous, because what people like to do when you mention what your favourite films are is put you in a box and never let you out of it, in the sense that those films that you say determine your characteristics and your film taste. That's not necessarily true, because as Michael proved with Interstellar, you don't have to think a film is objectively fantastic for it to be your favourite. I'm the same, as I said, with The Amazing Spider-Man. There's a lot wrong with that film. The pacing is very weird, but it's carried by a great central performance by Andrew Garfield and another one by Emma Stone, and it's one of my favourite films I've ever seen. It's so rewatchable. This is that, but with the other bit as well. The reason I haven't made a podcast about my favourite films is because I don't want to put myself into a box, but I'm quite happy with this being one of the boxes that I'm in. Hot Fuzz is absolutely spectacular. I will make no apologies for singing its praises. In terms of quotable films, this takes the biscuit. The script is so perfectly set up to be a classic. Every line seems to be sort of giddily written in anticipation of its genius. Again, Wright uses the idea of sequences and set pieces along with more kind of traditional techniques. However, the production of the design of this film is magnificent. In a sense, it should have been, because it's not actually too difficult to get English village core down to a T, but they've done it. It takes on English village life perfectly with the way it looks, the stereotypes thrown up to the nth degree. And Sergeant Angel is a completely different character to Shaun. Whereas Shaun liked to think that he was by the book and organised and had his life together, Sergeant Angel really does. He is the letter of the law. He is as ruthless, as efficient as it gets. In fact, the figures do start to go a bit squiffy when they take him out of London. He is so competent, in fact, that the Vicious Neighbourhood Watch Alliance, geniusly abbreviated to NWA, their difficulty is getting him to loosen up, and it becomes a problem for them. The film has a brilliant set of supporting characters. I doubt Olivia Colman thought she would win an Oscar having taken on the role of Doris in this film. A few years later, here we are. But they all offer a brilliant scope of different but undoubtedly similar figures to age the story's progression. If this story had simply been about Sergeant Angel and Constable Butterman, I don't think it would have had the effect it did. What makes it so fantastic is the fact that its supporting cast offer great insights into horrendous stereotypes at every step of the way. They're never far behind. They're always there to pick up a laugh. They're always there to reinforce the frustration that Sergeant Angel is feeling in this environment. It works brilliantly. It was a Hot Fuzz that truly made me see the connection that an editor and a director have to have, and that the editor isn't in charge of completely ensuring the film is placed together correctly or coherently or creatively, because Wright's shot choices in this are made with editing in mind, and you can really tell that because of the fast transitions. There's scenes consisting of several 0.3 second clips or whatever with perfectly accompanying music and sound, which give it a pacing that means even the dullest of actions, like buying something at a petrol station or waiting for a train or filling up a pint of cranberry juice, are treated as if they're almost overwhelming. It gives a fantastic pace to the story, and actually it lets the moments that need to breathe do that without the whole film slowing down. In this trilogy, that's obviously used for comedic effect, but in Last Night in Soho and Baby Driver, Wright shows that he can do this for creating tension or generating energy or introducing characters. Its film sees the use of far shorter scenes with emphatic cuts and amplifies them. There's a kinetic transition all the time, and it works brilliantly to counteract the dull nature of the village that it's set in. He also uses them to subtly tell the audience that there is something wrong with the winner of the Village of the Year, I don't know how many times, in Sanford. The film still maintains its sense of comedy gore from the previous film, be it Tim Messenger's head being removed by the top of a church tower, or Leslie Tiller tripping and falling on her own shears. It's absolutely fantastic. One of the key elements of this film is its ability to throw back to every tiny element of the story that's already been told. The most impressive example of this is towards the end of the film, when various corpses are found under the castle, consisting of gypsies, crusty jugglers, and dog muck. And such a small, possibly forgotten detail from an earlier line of dialogue becomes prominent again. It really hammers home the idea that the NWA is this organisation which is secretly so malicious and maniacal that you would never have seen it coming. And Peg Frost chemistry, again, is off the charts, and their interactions are perfect. I think this might be the film in which the two of them go together the best. They get Timothy Dalton to do loads of stupid stuff. That's one of the great things about it, is there's some fantastic actors in this film. As I said, Olivia Colman is there, Jim Broadbent, the Mighty, is there. Timothy Dalton is there, lifting up his trouser legs to reveal his sock ties above them. As I said, there is so much to this film, which for me makes it perfect. I could bore everyone. I'll try not to. I'll try and be a little bit more succinct. I have watched this film with several people when it's been their first viewing. And every single time, I think, what are they going to enjoy most? Are they going to enjoy the jokes? Are they going to enjoy the gore? Actually, what they enjoy is the fact that they do not know which turn the film is going to take. Hot Fuzz is structured perfectly, and by all accounts for a comedy it's quite long, but the reason it's quite long is because it has a fantastic scene right at the end. I say scene, it's more of a sequence in which Angel comes back to beat Sanford's ass and get a look at his arse. It's so brilliantly put together. It feels like a really genuinely epic conclusion to a ridiculous story. All the things that he's doing on screen, fighting old people, are completely ludicrous, and yet the film still somehow manages to make it cool. The tiny references to other films, so the idea that Bad Boys 2 plays out again with Butterman in the film, it's so well crafted. Every little detail is there for a reason, and is often not left unaddressed, but is also then readdressed later on at some point in the film. It's a really perfect introduction. I mentioned the fast cuts and the emphatic transitions, but the film opens in quite possibly the opposite of that. Sergeant Angel walks down a hallway for a far too long amount of time, but then we get immediately into Wright's fast-moving pace and fast-moving scenes. A great piece of juxtaposition to show the seriousness of the character versus the action he takes and then his personality afterwards. And the film is really heartwarming. It takes Sergeant Angel, who is this completely serious figure, on an emotional journey, and it links him with Constable Butterman, who is all heart. No structure, no rules, no efficiency, and yet they become a fantastic pairing. Do you know, it makes you fall in love with the village of Sanford, even though living there would obviously be hell. The script is razor sharp. One of the bits that sort of goes unnoticed, but is actually for me a real indication of how sharp the script actually is the first time that Angel and Danny are sat in the car together, and Angel's trying to get him to look at the wider picture, see that there's something always going on. He mentions Mr. Treacher in the coat, he mentions the guy with his hat pulled down below his face, and all of that happens in a really, really fast-paced way, and the rebuttals are fantastic, the jokes are great, and it's a really great example of how quick the script is, but it never leaves you behind. There's genuine wit, it's written by funny people, not by Hollywood executives who think they know that someone forgetting someone's name for the fourth time in the film Pitch Perfect 2 is a funny gag. It isn't. And it's a script that's had care put into it. It wasn't flushed out quickly so that the film could start happening. It was thought about. It was measured. Edgar Wright grew up in a village exactly like Sanford. And so for him, it was a real opportunity to use what he knew, turn it on its head, and parody it, and it's really great to see that there's someone who knows about the environment that they're working in generate a script like this. That's the reason why things like Dirty Grandpa are just not funny, because who in their life grew up with Robert De Niro as their grandfather making ridiculous comments and doing horrible things? Nobody. This film works because it is relatable to the director, and therefore he is able to convey its relation to the audience. Even if you are the most metropolitan person on the planet, you lived in the city, you lived in the suburbs your whole life, you've never ventured out of the country, you will have a stereotype of the country in your head, and some of it will fall perfectly into the script in this film. Some bits will surprise you, but it's all a great encapsulation of the, shall we say, slightly boring nature of village life, but turned up to a degree in which it would shock you more than anything you would see anywhere else. This is how genius this film is. Edgar Wright manages to make a swan a repeating motif in the film, and it fits and hits every single time. From Peter Ian Staker phoning up the police station, to the swan hunt with Angel and Danny, to the swan appearing on the CCTV outside George Merchant's house, to the swan appearing in the car with Frank at the end. And just the one swan, actually. It's so cleverly done. Every tiny little detail is worth its salt. It's used, it has a value, and it's made to be a functioning part of advancing the plot and the story, which is what all those little details should be, rather than just having them in for effect. It's similar to us in that sense. There's so many tiny images you can look at in this film which aid itself to the message and the theme and the advancement of the plot, which you may not see otherwise. You can examine this film forensically. You can sit back and enjoy it for what it is, as just a comedy. But whatever you do, you will reach something you enjoy. I will end my thoughts on Hot Fuzz there, but it is definitely my favourite film of all time. I have never tired of watching it, and I really hope that you all get on with it as much as I did. Till then, jog on. Mr. Skinner to the manager's office, Mr. Skinner. Okay, so moving on to the final film of the trilogy, which is The World's End. And this film focuses more than any other on Simon Pegg's character. Gary King is a lost soul, desperate to have a good time. He acts like an outlaw and plays life as it comes to him, and has absolutely no sense of forethought. And this is a seemingly new style in the role of the trilogy for Pegg. However, the lost soul theme sort of stays with him all through 3 films, just in different incarnations. In Shaun of the Dead, Shaun's stuck in his job with no idea where his life will go after a failed relationship. In Hot Fuzz, Angel is determined and strong-minded, but is being sent to a place where he doesn't fit in and thereby finds himself lost. And in The World's End, Gary has absolutely in his mind nothing left to fight for, and so is purely trying to have the best time possible. Gary King was Simon Pegg's favourite character to play, and is definitely the most complex of the trilogy selection, as he has nothing left in his mind to live for, so all goes out while still carrying the underlying problem of being at the end of his own road. The film centres around a pub crawl, with Gary having collected his old group of mates together for one final night on the town, where he wants no distractions from work, from relationships, or from anything. However, as you might expect, through no real fault of his own, the gang finds their way to, quite literally, the end of the world. Again, Wright uses sequences and brilliantly choreographed fight set pieces. This is probably the fightiest of all the films, and is somehow the most ludicrous in the trilogy in terms of story. Wright uses the final chance he has in this trilogy to ensure that his constant actors and their characters are given a fair run out, and they're given the opportunity to engage in personal and intimate interactions. And so, while the film's dressed up in quite a grand, end-of-the-worldy type clothes, it's essentially about people and how they get on, and this film is probably the prime example of that. The film's usually the least cited and quoted of the 3, and it's understandable to see why. The script has less merit than the other 2. This is definitely the weakest of the 3, not in some people's eyes, but in my eyes, and I think the reason for that is because, given that the scope for the film is go hell for leather, sometimes it can go a bit too far. The other 2 felt slightly restrained in terms of their parameters, whereas this goes absolutely wild. It's not as quotable because there are fewer quips, and there's impressive lengths of dialogue, and though occasionally it does definitely land memorable lines, instead the film looks at a far more regular human perspective, with Gary's hell for leather attitude questioned by literally everyone, and hence the film becomes a small character study of people who may appear wild and bright on the surface, but who harbour significant problems. It's less directionally impressive because I think it's less typical Wright, but I think that's what he was trying to go for. Instead of being a sort of fast-paced but slow when it needs to be piece, this feels all guns blazing. And it works in the context of the film, it just doesn't quite work in terms of the standard that's been set by the previous two. At the end of the film, Wright's world literally explodes, and I think that was kind of the idea he wanted to go for. He wanted to put a closure on these three films. They aren't connected, they're not in a series, they're just three films made by Wright and a very large group of the same amount of cast. The reason they are held as a trilogy is because they came out relatively in sequence with each other and they all feature a cornetto. These films make up a brilliantly linked set of different and yet oh so similar films with recurring themes, techniques, motives through shifted lines of vision. But for all their merits, these films are fantastically fun. Even if the audience just wants to sit back and enjoy, you can. If you want to read deeper into the meanings of things, you can. It caters for every single audience, and I think that's why I love these films so much, is because I haven't showed them to anyone yet who didn't like them. Everyone I've shown them to is a big fan, straight away, and it's very easy to see why, because there is something for everyone. World's End goes heavy on the effects, which the other two don't, and it feels to me like that's sort of subtracted from the typical natures of the other two, which made them so good. The focus on the fighting and the effects means there's less focus on the story and the characters. Despite the fact that a lot of the work in the film is characters talking, sometimes it doesn't feel as meaningful as it could be. The final scene is a brilliant character interaction. It never got better than that night scene. The reason why Gary drinks so much is a great revelation. It's a great reveal. It's a great ending to the story. But I think the film is a little too long to just get to that revelation and that be the only merit. Having said that, I do think it rounds off the other two films brilliantly. It's not as good as Shaun of the Dead, it's nowhere near as good as Hot Fuzz, but it's a film I will happily watch again and again. You might sense a theme of the pub in these, and that is quite biographical. Wright loves a drink, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost love a drink. In fact, the basis of Shaun of the Dead was brought about because Simon Pegg and Nick Frost were ensconced in a pub and Edgar Wright wanted them out, but they didn't want to go. World's End has, again, brilliantly subtle background details which aren't brought to the forefront in an attempt to make you look in a certain direction. They're left there subconsciously for you to slowly realise changes and understand where the plot is going, rather than having to force you in that direction itself. I love these films. Please watch them. You don't have to do them back to back, although it would be easier than The Lord of the Rings, that's for sure. This discussion's been a bit more brief. I'm doing that because I understand that the last three have been quite long, and I didn't want to push the runtime of this too much when it didn't need to be that long. I'm headed away on holiday, so I'm doing my best to record episodes in advance so that I can still get them out per week, because it feels like a nice schedule to have. However, having said that, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I could go into far more depth about why I love Hot Fuzz, but I feel like it would end up being a really uneloquent discussion, because I'd start just going, and the bit where they chase the swan's really funny, and his name's Aaron A. Aronson, because he mentions that before, and then he stabs him with a knife, and then Timmy Dalton slips on a truck. That's not the kind of podcast people want to listen to. I've tried to stick fairly to the cinematic merit in terms of its production and its themes. So hopefully you have enjoyed it. Again, as per usual, any feedback at all, do let me know. It's at BajoriDom on Twitter because someone took my name. I will see you next week for a hopefully slightly longer podcast. Just wanted to keep this one a little bit briefer, as I say. But thank you for downloading the podcast, and bye!